Ethiopia is at war with itself. A nation that has suffered for decades at the hands of oppressive regimes and dictatorships is once again returning to this familiar form of violence. But why? In 2019, Ethiopia seemed to be going in the right direction. The nation's new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, won the Nobel Peace Prize for ending the country's decades-long war with its neighbour Eritrea. But within a year, his government launched a military attack on the regional state of Tigray within Ethiopia. You might ask, why is he attacking his own country? To understand Ethiopia's plight, we need to step back a little and explore some context. Ethiopia is a landlocked country comprising of several ethnic groups. The largest is the Oromo. They represent approximately 35% of the country's population. The second largest is the Amhara, representing 27% of Ethiopia's population. Then there are the Somalis and Tigrayans, each representing about 6% of the population. The remaining quarter of the population is made up of dozens of other ethnic groups. There are over 80 distinct languages spoken in Ethiopia. For nearly half of the 20th century, the country was run by the Emperor Haile Selassie, who was eventually toppled during a military coup led by a Marxist faction in the armed forces. His regime was widely described as internationally friendly in its foreign policy, but authoritarian and illiberal in its domestic policy. As the communist takeover of Ethiopia commenced, numerous other movements came into fruition to oppose this new regime. The result was a nearly 20-year civil war that ended in 1991. One of the primary movements in this conflict was the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which overthrew the governing regime after seizing control of the capital, Addis Ababa. In doing so, Eritrea gained independence. At the same time, Ethiopia was reorganized on federal lines, officially becoming the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. The country's new constitution explicitly permitted succession, even laying out information on how constituent parts can break away from the country and become independent. Even though the country was now nominally democratic, in truth it became a one-party state. The Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, was an alliance of four political groupings that included the TPLF. Tigrayans, despite representing only 6% of the population, took up dominant roles in the federal government, including the post of Prime Minister, which was formerly occupied by Meles Zenawi from 1995 to 2012. Under his leadership, Ethiopia achieved one of the fastest economic growth rates in Africa. However, ethnic tensions between the Tigrayans and other groups continued to simmer unabated. In 2018, these ethnic divisions culminated in an election in which Abiy Ahmed, an ethnic Oromo, won. Given his ethnicity, tensions began to rise within the EPRDF, specifically from the TPLF, after Ahmed called for national unity, undermining Ethiopia's federal structure. In response, the TPLF held regional elections in September 2020. The TPLF won 98.2% of the vote and 100% of the 152 seats that were contested. This clearly demonstrated the will of the Tigrayan people in their defiance of the federal government's authority. As disagreements between Ahmed and the TPLF continued, Ahmed used this moment to create the Prosperity Party as the main governing party of the country. Crucially, the TPLF decided to not join. Ahmed also blocked federal funds from reaching Tigray, cutting off the prosperous region from the rest of the country. Several corresponding blockages of telecommunication, healthcare, education, and other services culminated in an attack by local Tigrayans on a federal military compound in Tigray. The result was a massive military invasion by both the federal military and corresponding Eritrean militias, seizing Tigrayan territory from the TPLF. Reports of mass casualties and human rights violations against civilians caught in the crossfire remains widespread. Meanwhile, reporters of this information, journalists, are being routinely harassed by Ethiopian security forces, threatening jail terms for publishing these claims. With little information coming out of the region due to this clamping down of telecommunications and independent reporting, the war continues unabated. While the international community has been quick to condemn the violence in Tigray, it has yet to find a solution to resolve it. On May the 24th, the US imposed visa restrictions for Ethiopian and Eritrean government officials and members of the security forces over atrocities tied to the months-long conflict. The US also imposed wide-ranging economic and security assistance restrictions to Ethiopia. Meanwhile, America has pledged to continue with humanitarian assistance and other critical aid to the country, including health, education, food, democracy, human rights, and other areas. The Biden administration will continue with its broad restrictions on aid to Eritrea. Also, the European Union has delayed budget support payments to Ethiopia following reports of the crisis. Despite calls for a ceasefire, Ethiopia's Ahmed has continued to wage his military campaign in Tigray, even as the UN estimates that approximately 90% of the local population risks starvation. Ahmed refuses to budge, claiming that victory is near. Within Ethiopia, support for the federal government's actions remains fervent, with many accusing foreign powers of undermining the nation's sovereignty. This is common sentiment in Africa, a continent once colonized by several European powers. These powers ransacked Africa of its natural resources and curtailed the civil liberties of the locals for decades. The result was an Africa ethnically divided and prone to violence and unrest. Despite the recent response from the international community, prior conflicts and military campaigns across Africa have been largely ignored by the US and its allies. For instance, the collective West largely stood idly by as the Rwandan genocide of 1994 took place, culminating in the deaths of up to 1.1 million people. The focus of many of these foreign powers was to remove their citizens from the country, but not to provide humanitarian assistance and diplomatic mediation. Actions like these and the historical behavior of Western nations has undoubtedly sowed the seeds of distrust prevalent among Africans today. The solution to this conflict will require the cooperation of both the TPLF and the Prosperity Party. Since the federal government has already established a new interim administration in Tigray and has issued arrest warrants for Tigrayan government and military elites, the prospect of peace looks slim. This is because the federal government has no desire for peace to begin with, especially since an outright military victory is near. There is also widespread hatred of the TPLF from within the Prosperity Party. Look at this statement from the Foreign Minister. The international community has to understand the ordeal Ethiopia and Ethiopians went through for over 27 years. For the record, Abiy inherited in 2018 an Ethiopia and Ethiopians abused by a rotten, kleptocratic, and ethno-nationalist group that not only robbed the country but also reduced it to a clannish, fake federalism which has left nothing but a deeply divided society. Meanwhile, TPLF officials argue that this war is waged not against the TPLF only, but against Tigrayan people in general. They are striving to liquidate Tigray's political identity and remove it from the map without due regard for whether or not the people get exterminated in the process. So this begs the question, if peace was on the horizon, what would that look like? To win the favor of the Tigrayan public, Abiy must ensure the swift withdrawal of all Eritrean and Amhara forces from Tigray. He must also immediately permit aid to reach all Tigrayans in desperate need. Most importantly, both the federal and regional Tigrayan governments must head to the negotiation table to settle their disputes. To justify claims that no atrocities against civilians and journalists are being committed, federal authorities must allow human rights groups, news reporters, and humanitarian aid into the area. Certainly, Ethiopia's regional and international partners, especially the US, can verify the validity of these crimes, bolstering the credibility of Abiy's government. However, continued resistance to these actions only serves to intensify the claims of the TPLF and local Tigrayans against the federal government position. For now, federal resistance is an act of submission. While the cessation of all violence is a vital first step, negotiations over an autonomous Tigrayan state is next on the agenda. Since the Ethiopian constitution permits succession, Tigray is well within its bounds to break away from mainland Ethiopia. However, given the federal government's regional intervention, the degree of autonomy is the key question at hand. Since 1991, Ethiopia's regions were given some level of autonomy from Addis Ababa. This continues to be enjoyed even today. So perhaps a wiser strategy would be to give Tigrayans greater autonomy to govern themselves, but within the country's federalist structure. It is unlikely that other regions would begin to demand similar terms, because the divide between Addis Ababa and Ethiopia's other ethnic groups isn't as intense. With Tigrayans on the verge of national sovereignty in this matter, Addis Ababa should be able to bring an end to hostilities. Ultimately, a commitment to working with each other and improving the lives of all Ethiopians should be the end goal of both parties. While this is a pipe dream, it is, in my view, a credible way to improve the current situation. After all, a commitment to peace is the best, if not the only strategy.